Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. We have spent this entire month of August and the month preceding it, leading up to this moment. Penn State Nittany Lions set to hit the road, take on the West Virginia Mountaineers, kick off their 2024 campaign, which, of course, if you've heard by now, has college football playoff expectations all around it. We've heard from a lot of players this week. We've heard from James Franklin multiple times. We have seen Penn State practice, and I was joined at all those different events by Mark Brennan and Daniel Gallen, who now join me on the Lions 24/7 podcast. You heard from our three-man group here on the podcast late last week, kind of recapping preseason camp, evaluating the Nittany Lions depth chart. It gets very, very real now, fellas. By the end of this episode, we're going to give our predictions for not just game one, but for the entire regular season and whether this Penn State squad punches its ticket to the college football playoff. But first and foremost, Mark, before I get carried away with all the content and intel we're going to provide our listeners, make sure they know what they can find at lions247.com in case some of you out there listening have not yet joined us over at the site.
Yeah, we're running our best subscription special of the year, 75% off an annual pass. I mean, it comes out to less than $225 a month, so you really can't go wrong. And this will get you on board at the VIP level, which means recruiting, insider intel, access to all of the VIP discussions on the Lions Pride board, which I think people will find invaluable during football games and during the season, especially transfer portal intel. All that sort of stuff. Great time to do it. Season's about to kick off. You come on now for 75% off. Again, it's less than $225 per month. That'll take you all the way around to next year. Hopefully by that time, we'll be talking about a college football playoff appearance. I'm not being a homer. I just want to cover the college football playoff for once. I just want to get in there and cover that thing, as painful as the travel may be. But I'm looking forward to hopefully getting an opportunity to do that. But if you're a Penn State fan, great time to come on board. Tyler Calvaruso does a great job. Brian Doan, our national guy who helps us, goes way overboard to help us on the recruiting side, and the entire team does an awesome job. And then the other thing to remember is you get read-only access to every other message board on the network. And during the season, that's just unbelievable because you can go over and see what the folks at West Virginia are talking about before, during, and after the game. You could go over and see what the folks at Ohio State are talking about. I don't want to leave other opponents out, but you get the point. So it's a great time to come on. We don't go heavy pitching on this show all the time, but it's a great opportunity, and we don't want to let it go by. 75% off limited time.
Yeah, and you covered it there, that we got a large, massive network. We're engaged with CBS. We're engaged with our entire 24/7 partnerships all over the country. We had Chris Anderson, the insider down there for 24/7 Sports West Virginia's site. He was on our last podcast. If you missed that, we spent about 20.
That's an excellent site too, man. That is an excellent site. Go check it out.
We spent about 20 minutes breaking down this West Virginia team coming out of their own preseason camp. We're not going to talk a lot about the Mountaineers specifically, more matchup-related content and Penn State this time around. But if you missed the last episode, which dropped on Tuesday, highly encourage you to check that one out for a full perspective on West Virginia coming out of preseason camp. And I'll note, we do a damn good job of covering basketball season around here too. Daniel and Mark cover that team as closely as anyone, and we're also covering basketball recruiting as closely as anyone. So with this 75% offer, it takes you all the way in through next August. And so you're talking about just a ton of coverage coming your way. We'll nip that in the bud. I'm going to remind folks at the end of the episode, though, better believe about this offer. But let's focus in on the Penn State football updates that have surfaced this week. Daniel, you and I spent quite a chunk of time earlier this week reviewing some of the early week rumblings, some of the takeaways from James Franklin's Monday press conference. And we said, let us go to practice and let us bring you back some intel. And we'll lead off with some good news in the receiver room. Caden Saunders, Liam Clifford, neither of which were out there at practice last week when we took our last look at preseason camp. They were both active participants with the wide receiver group. We've heard a lot of good things about Liam Clifford, really based on feedback, never worried about Liam Clifford being, his status being in jeopardy for this matchup. But Caden Saunders was categorized as more of an expanded absence during August. So to see him back out there, we know what he can do at the slot receiver potentially, but also really important to note here, road opener, punt returner. It's a really pivotal spot potentially in this matchup. And so Saunders looks like a step in the right direction. Liam Clifford, don't lose any sleep over it. What do you make of that for this wide receiver room and what we've learned about this group overall? Because James Franklin made sure we know the buzz is not just directed towards a couple guys. Omari Evans needs some spotlight as well.
Yeah, I think looking at Saunders and Clifford being back at practice, it's only a positive. With a lot of these positions, you look at them on paper and you can see a lot of bodies and feel good about the depth. But then you take one guy away, then you take two guys away, like we didn't see at practice last week, and then things can start to feel dicey. Things can start to feel uncertain. But with those two back, I mean, Liam Clifford had maybe one of the buzzier camps, maybe the buzziest camp on the offensive side of the ball, outside of maybe Luke Reynolds. I think Clifford was really up there in terms of the positive feedback we got from coaches and teammates there. Saunders is someone who, when you think about Andy Kotelnicki and you think about this new Penn State offense, he is sort of the archetype of the player that can really benefit when you talk about motion, horizontal movement, getting players in the space, letting them make things happen with the ball in their hands. And like you said, you can't underrate him as a punt returner. I think that that's something that's very valuable when you talk about a team like Penn State and the level that it wants to compete at this year. Can't lose games on the margins. You can't lose a game when you fumble a punt or you give up 20 yards of field position by letting one bounce. I think special teams is something that when you look at it from that perspective, super valuable. And like you said, we got a pretty hearty endorsement for Omari Evans from James Franklin last night or on Wednesday night. Evans is someone whose name has come up every once in a while, along with Trey Wallace, Liam Clifford, Julian Fleming, and then Caden Saunders. But Franklin said that Evans has had a great camp. He's someone that I think we all had high expectations for going into last year. Didn't see him against West Virginia in the opener. Barely saw him the rest of the way until the very end of the season. So I think the term that James Franklin used was that Evans is someone that could take off this year, make a couple of big plays early, change the perception of him, show what he can do, utilize that, and then go from there. So I think where we are with the wide receiver room right now, I mean, I think we're all still in prove it mode when it comes to this group as a whole, when it comes to some of these players individually. But you do some of that confidence that emanates from James Franklin, from Drew Allar, you internalize that a little bit, and it does make you feel a little bit more secure, but we'll see what happens when the lights go on Saturday.
I'm not sure if externally among Penn State fans, among Penn State reporters, that the needle has moved all that much about how we feel about receiver compared to March or even going into August. But internally, taking the temperature of the people who are within this process day by day, there's a different level of confidence than we've sensed regarding that room in a while. And it's not regarding new guys. It's not all centered on, well, we have Julian Fleming now, and he's going to be our wide receiver one. It's not, oh, we brought in Tyseer Denmark, and he's going to be a starter. Tyseer Denmark is going to have to fight to see the field this year as a freshman, at least early on. But Mark, I think what's really compelling is as Daniel laid out there with Omari Evans, a few big plays, a nice stretch of the season, and all of a sudden the perception about one guy or this entire position room can really change. You talk about Harrison Wallace, and we will later, Omari Evans, Caden Saunders, Liam Clifford. Very little to show for body of work consistently at this college level, and yet if one or two or three of these guys hit, our perception of what this offense can accomplish can change in a hurry.
I think Omari Evans is the poster child for James Franklin's complaint last year that Mike Yurcich wasn't getting the ball in the hands of their best playmakers. Daniel had a stat. Can you tell us what that stat was about Omari Evans? I mean, it was unbelievable. I don't want to steal it because it was fantastic.
No, I was looking through the PFF stats last night to get the feel for how much Omari Evans actually played last year, and I saw that he was on the field for more snaps than Liam Clifford last year, which something that surprised me. But then you look at the breakdown, and Omari Evans was on the field for more run snaps than pass snaps last year. When he got into the game, it was garbage time. That's when he got that touchdown against Delaware. But when he was on the field, it was when Penn State was trying to run out the clock, get to the finish line. They weren't necessarily looking for those big plays. And I thought that was something that was pretty striking to me when you think about Evans, who he is as a player and what he does well.
But also just how little he played. And then once Yursich was gone, what happened? 25-yard catch versus Rutgers, 60-yard catch at Michigan State. And it's like, where was this guy all year? You can't really say that about Trey Wallace. Tyler and I have been having fun about it. Could he be a breakout player this year? Could he not be? You could look at it either way. But in all honesty, I think we all thought that had he been healthy last year, he would have been one of those key guys that would have been dependable. And I think, I don't want to talk for you guys, but I have a sense that as a staff, we're looking at it as he's kind of a proven commodity, knock on wood, if he can stay healthy. So I think it's more about the Amari Evans. I think it's more about Caden Saunders. I mean, we saw Caden Saunders. The thing I loved about him, he goes out, does some nice things at the end of that Ohio State game. So many of their so-called leaders did not come out and meet the media afterward. And I know that some people took issue with the way Drew Allar handled himself. I thought that's ridiculous. I thought he was fantastic after that game, taking ownership. But Caden Saunders, guy barely plays all year. You lose the biggest game of the year, and that guy's out talking to us. That told me something.
He's been a fun the program kind of guy for a while, Mark. I remember his recruitment process. You had, I think, Alabama, Ohio State started, the Sharks started circling him a little bit. And he knew his role as a leader within that 2022 class, which we know proved to be a huge class for Penn State. He was the first commitment there, and he was always out front, whether it was coming on the podcast with us or whether it was putting stuff on social media, doing the best he could to put that class forward and to make sure everyone knew how locked in he was. So I'm not surprised it has translated this way as he's grown up a little bit within this roster.
But now these guys and Liam Clifford, these guys have to be consistent. Okay. Mm-hmm. And part of that is staying healthy. And part of that, okay, you didn't get the opportunities last year. We have a pretty good sense that Kotelnicki, he doesn't care. He is going to get his best players the ball. The guys, as Daniel said, in space, doing things. So you're going to have the opportunities if you can do it, I think. And now we're back to the point of, this is the one position, I think, on the entire team that we're looking at and saying, okay, the vibe is right. Mm-hmm. But we've had good vibes about other positions going into seasons, and it didn't play out that well. I mean, how many straight years did we go with, this is going to be the year the offensive line is going to play well? And then finally, was it 2 years ago that Franklin finally said, I'm done talking about the offensive line? And then they finally played well. So maybe that's the case this year, that they can actually step up. But hey, this is major college football. They're going to have to prove it to themselves, to the coaching staff, and to the media and to the fans.
And guys, perhaps we've been getting this wrong and searching for the number one target for the passing game from the receiver room, because they've got Tyler Warren on board. And James Franklin on Wednesday night did not hold back in his praise of the fifth-year senior who's taking another step forward after being a co-starter with Theo Johnson last year. Johnson's now a rookie with the New York Giants. He said that Tyler Warren is the most complete tight end in the country. We followed up with Ty Howell, the tight ends coach, Thursday morning as well, and he reiterated his thoughts, and both of them really kept coming back to the same bullet points with why that is the case. Not only is he tremendous receiving threat, go turn on the film from that Peach Bowl. I know there was a lot of lowlights involved there, but his performance was one of the highlights, and racing away from defenders down the field at certain points at his size is pretty remarkable. And then his ability to be a bruiser in the blocking game, to open holes for Nick Singleton and Katron Allen, to get from a defensive end to a linebacker on the same play and handle his business. I mean, this is what is he listed? 6'6", 260 pounds. He's fast. Daniel, they are beating the drum, and I think we all anticipate there will be other tight ends involved. There will be more two tight end sets. But for the first time in a while, I don't know if maybe going back to probably 2020 with Pat Freiermuth, it feels like they have a true individual vocal point at tight end, and that is Tyler Warren.
Warren's definitely the guy at tight end. There's no 1A, 1B this year. He's just the number one, and I think it's very deserved. The way that Ty Howell phrased it Thursday morning was that it's rare. That was the word that he used to describe Warren in terms of what he's able to do in the passing game and what he's able to do in the running game. And I think that that's something that when you look long-term, that can permeate down throughout the room and set the standard for what these young guys need to do in terms of stepping up. And given what Ty Howell said, given what James Franklin has said, it seems that that's worked a little bit. But with Warren, I think that he's definitely in position to have a big year. I think that he's a little bit under the radar nationally. When you look at some of the preseason All-American teams, even preseason All Big Ten teams, Colson Loveland at Michigan has gotten a lot of love out of this conference. And then the Georgia tight ends as well. And I think that part of that is what they did last year, Brock Bowers going through there, the prominence of that program. But I think by the time we get to the end of the year, Tyler Warren is someone who will be in that conversation, will potentially be in the mix for that Mackey Award. Obviously, when you get to some of these individual awards and on a team like Penn State, the counting stats thing always comes up because of the way that a lot of guys play, the way that they utilize different players. But I just think that by the time we get to the NFL draft next year, Warren will be in that conversation for one of the first tight ends off the board. That's because he's able to do so many different things, and he's willing to do so many different things. We've seen that since 2021 when he really started getting playing time as a gadget player near the goal line. And that's just expanded. So I think he's someone that I'm really excited to see this year. And I think that when you hear praise like this, you know that James Franklin doesn't give it out too often. At the same time, sometimes you wonder, is this just building up a guy? Is this kind of trying to stake your claim on the national stage? But I think that this is very deserved and very true with where we're standing right now.
And you can understand why Penn State maybe needs to go on the PR attack here with guys, trying to get the name out there. And this happens with Heisman Trophy final contenders. You want your stars as national parts, as national conversation pieces. So your brand is attached to that. And I think the most obvious reason why Tyler Warren maybe isn't discussed nationally like he's discussed here in Happy Valley is you look at the stat sheet. Last year was his breakout year, right? But it was 29 catches, 295 yards. You work your way to those 7 touchdowns, it looks prettier. But I don't think a lot of people who are trying to cover 120 teams at the national level are going to see that stat line and say, this is one of the top tight ends in the country. But we have to remember, people, that Theo Johnson last year, 32 catches, 325 yards, 6 touchdowns as they were sharing that load. But the tight end conversation got even more interesting on Wednesday evening, in my opinion, because I followed up with James Franklin as we moved on from Tyler Warren to ask about the absence of Khalil Dinkins. It's now 3 consecutive looks for us going back to pretty early in August that we have not seen Khalil Dinkins out there with the team. Obviously, that's not trending in a good direction for West Virginia. And so with that in mind, James Franklin says Andrew Rapplier is going to, quote, play a ton in game 1. The redshirt freshman, who I think he had fewer than 50 total snaps last season collectively. He could approach that total this Saturday. We'll find out. And then, Mark, even more compelling, Luke Reynolds will play, according to James Franklin. He's still wearing his number 85 jersey out there. This was the week where we keep tabs on which freshmen are now wearing scout team uniforms. And it's most of them now that are representing West Virginia players on the field. But he's got his 85 on, and he is somebody who has put on 30 pounds. Ty Howell, Tyler Warren both say he's already been an established pass target, a weapon in the passing game for a long time. But what has kind of won this staff over, along with the physical gains, is his willingness to get engaged as a run blocker. He's not where he wants to be. He's not where they want him. I don't think he's going to play 25-plus snaps by design. But the former number 1 overall tight end recruit that all 3 of us saw multiple times here in the camp circuit last summer is going to be active, and he is going to play against West Virginia. I think that is a significant deal.
Yeah, you could look back to Pat Fryermuth, who was a summer enrollee as a freshman, but he was a postgraduate kid, and he was already 250 whatever pounds. I think when you look at Luke, how important was it for him at that position, at his weight? What did he weigh when he got here? 220?
214.
Yeah. So to be a mid-year enrollee and to go through the strength program and go through spring practice and to be able to slowly but surely build yourself up, I think was obviously just gigantic for him. He ends up being the touchdown king in preseason camp, which I think opened all of our eyes a little bit. I would say this. I think the fact that James didn't declare him a green light, hopefully that bodes well for Dinkins. Hopefully that means that, because if they thought Dinkins was going to be out for a long time, I mean, Reynolds would be like a no-brainer green light.
And Mark, before we go too far, I just want to say this. Dinkins was getting serious buzz from this team about being a versatile piece, a guy that can move around, going to play. I think he went into the preseason camp as a slight favorite for that number 2 job. We were all wondering what Andrew Rapplier would do, but he's unavailable the last few weeks, and this is a heck of a room, so he's going to have to work his way back. I just want to note that because
Yeah.
Dinkins really did set himself up well here as a redshirt junior.
Although I will say in the blue-white game, it sure looked like Rapelier was getting the first team. So, I mean, you don't know what happened in between there. I mean, and Dinkins, last year we saw he was like Chris Carter. All he did was catch touchdowns, right? So that's for our younger viewers. It's an old Buddy Ryan reference that it's actually pretty cool. If you look into it, it's actually a compliment, I think, to Chris Carter. But no, I mean, the point being, look at the depth that they've developed, that you're able to bring a kid in. And, James Franklin says he's going to make, he's going to see a bunch of action. But then if you're able to get Dinkins back, well, then that gives you the flexibility to do what you did with Rapelier last year, even though he was good enough to play. You didn't want to waste him when you had the amount of talent that they had. So just a really good spot. And I think as we look at that wide receiver position, and you kind of hinted at this, Tyler, as you look at that wide receiver position, I think this gives them just a little bit of wiggle room that if they aren't quite there right off the bat, there are some other places they could look, whether it's the tight ends, whether it's the running backs, who I think both of the key guys, Katron Allen and Nick Singleton, are quality receivers out of that backfield. So there is some wiggle room, but ultimately, if this team wants to be as good as it's going to be and compete against the level of teams that it wants to compete against, you're going to have consistent play from those wide receivers.
And this team's number 3 running back, Cam Wallace, very natural receiver as well, someone who can do multiple things out of the backfield. And Franklin did tease, as we're talking about maybe not seeing 3 wide receivers out there with regularity. He did talk about it last night, looking at those 2 back looks, whether it's Cam Wallace and Nick Singleton or Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. He said the most important thing there is that you have a back who is an outstanding ball carrier, but also an outstanding lead blocker. And it sounds like they have the pieces. It's going to be fun to watch because Kotelnicki, I just don't think anything's off the table. I mean, whether that's Venga Ioane running a motion in the backfield as a lead blocker, nothing is off the table. And that starts this Saturday and that extends through the season. Daniel, we got a pretty long look, and I would say our longest look really at this offensive line of August on Tuesday, and really gives us a good sense of how things have materialized, really matches up what we projected on our depth chart last week at Lions247.com as well. The first group that we saw out there from left to right was Drew Shelton, Venga Ioane, Nick Dawkins, Sal Wormley, and then Anthony Donko. The second group that we saw from left to right was Javen Williams, JB Nelson, Dominic Rulli, Cooper Cousins, and Nolan Rucci at right tackle. And some people are like, who is Dominic Rulli? He's a walk-on player. He's been a valuable reserve for them at the center position. But in the situation where they're in a game, Daniel, I think we're going to lean towards either Venga Ioane or Cooper Cousins being next man up at center behind Dawkins. So knowing what we now know about this offensive line, and James Franklin has acknowledged a couple times that there will be an ongoing competition at right tackle. I think we're going to see both of them involved early and often, Rucci and Donko against West Virginia. How do you kind of view this group? I mean, we've been talking about it for a long time. What the shuffled deck was going to end up looking like in week 1? We're going to see maybe 8 guys involved, but your thoughts on the initial 5 and then what comes after?
I think that you start at left tackle, and when you talk about Drew Shelton, and I think the fact that Javen Williams got all of those reps in the spring, I think James Franklin, his quote was at some point either in the spring or the summer was that Williams did enough to earn legit time at left tackle. And so we had that penciled in as a competition coming into fall camp. And for Drew Shelton to, I think, assert that, for us to drop the or off of our depth chart projection and lock him in there, I think that speaks to the job that he's done in coming back from injury. You had some quotes on the message board from Nick Dawkins, I believe, about the work that Shelton did. Very glowing response from Dawkins about Shelton. And I think that's really where a lot of this starts. You're replacing the number 11 overall pick in the NFL draft and an All-American at left tackle in Olu Fashanu, who was pretty set it and forget it. I mean, it's the irony where when you have an All-American offensive lineman, a lot of the time you're not really talking about them that much. And that's what Olu was last year. And for Shelton to come in, assert himself there, I think that you take that as a positive moving into the year. But I'm just curious as to how you're going to play 8 guys. You're going to keep these rotations going. Cooper Cousins is a green light. So we're going to see
he's pounding on the door.
Is that going to be at Sal Wormley's expense at right guard? Is that going to be at center with Nick Dawkins? How does JB Nelson fit into this? James Franklin went out of his way earlier in camp to emphasize how they view JB Nelson and what his role could be. There's a lot of this that I'm really curious to see, and obviously that right tackle battle too. Caden Wallace did such a good job locking down that position and playing at a really, really high level last year. Is that something that you noticed this year? Do you notice that drop off? And Rucci, Donka, two guys who have not played a lot of football in their careers, especially at right tackle, when you consider where they were playing, where they began their careers and where they played last year. So I'm really interested to see. We've talked about how the Phil Trautwein and this offensive line gets the benefit of the doubt now, but I'm still kind of wanting to wait and see once we actually get there, because we haven't seen these five play together.
Yeah, and I think you brought up Dawkins on Shelton, talking about his improvement this year. He says he sees a very different player at left tackle, and of course, remember, this whole team has seen Drew Shelton a bunch at left tackle. He started the final 5 games of his freshman year. He was much different physically then. You got to remember, he was a summer enrollee back then. It was playing catch up in a hurry. Phil Trautwein and him moving week to week, trying to get better, and ultimately all the way through the Rose Bowl. Then he starts last year in the Peach Bowl, and I know there were some concerns about his performance overall, but then we learned, well, he was banged up. He needed surgery. You're not going to see him in the spring. And so I want to share one more note from Denai Dennis Sutton that we got coming out of preseason camp, because Denai knows him pretty well. Not only were they classmates in that 2022 group, but they tend to battle quite often on the practice field at their respective positions. And Dennis Sutton said that the scouting report early on Drew Shelton when he was a freshman was bull rush him into the backfield, bull rush him to the quarterback, overpower him, and kind of get his feet out from underneath him and push him into the backfield. And he said, defensive ends could find success that way. He said, you try that now, you're going to get stood up. And he said that is the biggest thing. He's always had tremendous feet. We've always noted that he almost moved like a basketball forward with his footwork in high school. That was always a positive trait for him. But the power that he's been able to do, and also fundamentally from his base, I know Phil Trautwein has been really pleased with his progression. So I think you're right, Daniel. That is really the kind of what my biggest takeaway is, that Drew Shelton has come back from a setback and come back very strong. Also hearing very good. If Nick Dawkins isn't the top leader in that room, and he is, then it may be Drew Shelton, which is, I think, saying something, because they have other guys with experience. Mark, you referenced it earlier on the show. There are so many years where the offensive line just didn't meet expectations. Phil Trautwein has won himself the benefit of the doubt. Yeah. There's legitimate depth. We've covered a lot of ground on Shelton. Is there a different point, a different talking point within this offensive line that you'd like to address before we move on?
No, I think it was Denai who also mentioned that, he has seen them go some unbalanced or 6 offensive linemen, which could be a way. I mean, I'm not sure exactly who was in that role, but that would seem like something like a Nolan Rucci or even a Javen, that you could use either of those guys as an extra offensive lineman in short yardage. So I think the fact, sometimes people look at it and say, hey, you're talking about playing 8 offensive linemen. That's not necessarily a good thing. It's best to have that NFL model. I don't agree with that. I think if you have 8 guys who are good enough, now we've covered a lot of Penn State football teams where they didn't have 5 guys who were good enough on the offensive line. No, in all seriousness, I mean, early in James Franklin's career, they had to bring, Derek Dowry and Gaia over from defense, because they had so few offensive linemen due to the sanctions and the way Bill O'Brien was recruiting. And it took them a while to get out of that. But I think if you're in a position where you have guys who are that good, why not keep them fresh? Why not rotate people in? So I think that's actually a bonus for them. And I think the job that they've done recruiting and developing, Phil Trautwein, when he first got here, he just wasn't, at least with the media, he wasn't the most outwardly kind of confident guy. And over the last couple of years, and I mean this in a positive way, because when you come from a program like BC, and then you get now you're at Penn State and you have 20 reporters around you, or you're on a Zoom call with all these reporters, that's not necessarily the easiest thing, even for a former NFL player, because as a coach, you have to be careful in what you say. You can't mention certain stuff. You don't want to throw your kids under the bus. He has developed over the last few years that if you have an opportunity to talk to him, just a tremendous, informative, intelligent. You could tell the guy's played at the highest level, and you can tell that he knows how to get that across. Some guys who were NFL players aren't good teachers, and we see it at camp when he's out there with Frank Leonard, and I think Frank Leonard's been a very positive influence. When you see those guys out there working with linemen, I don't know how to teach an offensive lineman, but you can tell that these kids are kind of absorbing what they're doing. And for people who don't realize, when we go to some of these Penn State camps, they will take out 4 or 5 of the best linemen and work specifically with them for a little bit just to see how they do. And to watch that whole process and what they put them through. And then that he is able to bring over, we saw it with Shelton a couple of years ago. And this year we saw it with Cooper Cousins, where Cooper Cousins is there now teaching. To me, you're a great teacher if you're bringing in a true freshman and he could come and help you teach these young campers. And I know I'm kind of going off there, but I just think the development of Phil Troutwine, we haven't talked about it enough. And not we, I mean, the Penn State beat. We've talked about it a lot here, but I mean, the Penn State beat, I don't think he has gotten enough credit for his development as a coach at this level.
He's the real deal. And I'll tell you what, if they do it again this year and this offensive line is a strength, 3 consecutive years where it's not an issue, I mean, you got to put him in the conversation of the best hires that James Franklin has made here at Penn State for 11 years, because how many years was it? We need the offensive line to take the next step. It has to happen. And it didn't happen with other coaches, didn't happen in other offenses. And we've now seen Phil Troutwine produce with a couple different offensive coordinators. He's got another one to work with here. That's never an easy thing in kind of matching identities, but he has done a hell of a job. And I think what's even more impressive, or we should just add along with this 2 deep that they've cultivated, is they've got a lot of interesting pieces developing in the background this year as well. Egan Boyer, Garrett Sexton, Donnie Harbor, Caleb Brewer, Chimdi Ono, just a lot of really compelling pieces. They may not all long-term emerge for this team, but Phil Troutwine has done a good job.
And Tyler, recruiting as well. I mean, don't look at some of the kids that they've landed, including for the 26 class. I mean, so when you have guys playing well and when you're sending guys into the league, that keeps building on itself. The better you do, the better you're going to recruit at those positions. And the more of these linemen like Cooper Cousins who are able to contribute fairly early are going to start showing up on campus.
Yeah, top 24/7 offensive lineman Malachi Goodman coming up near his decision. Penn State's one of those hats on the table. We'll see if another guy jumps on board. Daniel spent far longer on the offensive line topic than I anticipated jumping into it. But before we get into our focus on the West Virginia matchup and our predictions for that and the upcoming season, just wanted to mention we got our final conversation with Drew Allar on Wednesday morning. There have been a lot of conversations with and about Drew over the course of this entire year. What is kind of the final makeup that you're seeing here? Last look before the curtain opens, what are you buying into with Drew Allar in terms of improvement, and what are you still really curious to see on Saturday?
This was our first time talking to Drew Allar since he was named a team captain earlier this month, and we've had the opportunity these past 2 weeks to ask a bunch of his teammates and his coaches about what that means. And I think this week, hearing from Nick Dawkins, Devon J. Thomas, and KJ Winston, especially those last 2, Winston and J. Thomas, because with Devon, you're talking about a 6-year senior who has seen a lot during his time at Penn State. And with Winston, you're talking about a captain from the defensive side of the ball. To get that perspective, I think to have those endorsements, to hear them talk about how they've seen him step out a little bit more, be more vocal, I thought was really interesting. Allar explained that a little bit on Wednesday in his Zoom call with us. He said that it came up in his exit interviews with James Franklin, Andy Kotelnicki, and Danny O'Brien, and it was something that he wanted to work on this offseason. So he went ahead and was in communication with Chuck Losey about how things were going for the team, what was working, what wasn't. And so I think that we've seen a little bit more of a confident Drew Allar. We've seen him talk about being more vocal. We haven't had the chance really to see him be more vocal. I think Devon was saying that we'll see it eventually, that they see it all the time in practice. we might not get to see it during our brief windows, but on game days, we'll see how he's being more vocal, how he's leading more. I did think one of the more interesting things that came up on Wednesday was the conversation about being in that sort of fishbowl as the Penn State quarterback came up, and Drew was pretty open about it. He said that he's deleted his social media now, that his agents, they're going to handle posting the tweets if he's got to do a brand obligation, something along those lines. And he said that he did that last year, but he kind of feels like he might have waited too long to do that. And we know that when you're the quarterback in today's day and age, there's a lot of attention on you. And, maybe having that direct line into your psyche in your pocket at all times might not be the best way to manage things. And so Allar was, I thought, pretty candid about that. And he said that he loves the fan base and that he likes being on campus and having kids come up to him and talk about being in class, that sort of thing. But, he said that, I think Audrey Snyder posed the question, and it was something along the lines of, now versus last year. And he said that, last year his answer would have been completely different from what it is now, in terms of handling that and approaching that. So I think that you are seeing a little bit more of a mature Drew Allar. I've always thought that he's been pretty mature in all of his interactions with us, but another year older, more experience. He said that you can't really measure how much that experience means to you, how much that helps you. So I think that from what we've heard from the mental side, the off the field stuff, it's all been positive with Allar this offseason. I think we're all still waiting to see what it looks like in the offense and what it's going to look like on Saturday, and if he's going to throw the ball downfield, if he's going to take risks, if we feel like he's taking every check down to avoid throwing interceptions. There's all of that stuff that we're still really waiting to see. But I do think that you feel pretty good about where things stand. And I think that Allar is probably in a position, we talked about this earlier this month when he spoke, but when things aren't going well, he does seem like that he is in a better position this year to potentially pull himself out of that skid and to help the team pull out of the skid too. And I think that if you want to get to where Penn State wants to go, that is something that's going to be really, really important.
I think Drew, just like all of us, knows only so much he can say right now in August or back then in March or in the middle of the summer, that it doesn't really matter to so many people. It's going to matter what happens during those 60 minutes this upcoming Saturday and then the several Saturdays to follow for QB1 with Penn State football. Let's dive into this matchup a little bit more. Again, if you didn't hear it, we had Chris Anderson on Tuesday with us breaking down the Mountaineers for about 20 minutes. We're going to focus on this from more of a Penn State perspective naturally. And Mark, when you look at the clear strength versus strength outlook here, it would be West Virginia's rushing attack. They ultimately were the top rushing team in yards per game by the end of 2023 among Power 5 teams. And then, of course, Penn State. We know they ranked among the elites of the elite in college football last year in terms of rushing defense. We talked about their defensive tackle group with James Franklin yesterday. They really feel they can go at least 5 deep there. Alonzo Ford's emergence has been huge for them. And so with the tandem like West Virginia has and the dual threat quarterback, no quarterback in the country last year ran for more touchdowns than Garrett Green. He had 13 scores on the ground. We saw that he was fleet of foot in the opener, and then you got those edge rushers chasing him. So I'm going to throw it all your way, Mark, here. What do you make of this matchup, this test for the defensive front of Penn State? We've talked about the depth. We've talked about the losses. There's been a dismissal that impacted things. It's a heck of a matchup for them to begin.
Well, I think discipline is going to be the key, and I don't think just for the defensive front. I mean, I think those guys are going to have to do what they do, and maybe they're not making every play. But when you have a quarterback who averages 6.4 yards per carry, and remember, that factors in sacks. I mean, quarterbacks at the college level, it's not like the NFL. Their sack yardage goes against their rushing total. So 6.4 yards per carry is kind of, ridiculous. Now, fortunately, Penn State has seen this guy and knows what he's all about. But, how do you combat that? You have to have your athletes know where he's going to be. And, whether that's Tony Rojas, whether that's Jalen Reed from that lion position. And that's why I'm saying I don't think it's all about, whether it's Abdul Carter if you're not necessarily playing off the edge? Or are you dropping him back and making sure that he can spy him a little bit? I think the whole key to stopping this offense, because you're looking at last year, 53% of the passes completed. They're not going to really kill you with the passing game. So you have to be absolutely disciplined. And that's not always the easiest thing to do. They're not going to be able, that defensive front that you're talking about, they can't just cut loose and get after this guy. They have to maintain their, gaps and everything, and just be accountable for their area. And I think if they do that, they have enough athletes that they're going to be okay. But it's going to be interesting to see, do they try to spy him with a Rojas or with a Jalen Reed? Or, again, could you imagine, this is the intriguing thing about Abdul Carter, all the different things you can do with him and all the different places you could put him to try to combat this. So to me, that's going to be the most important part, is being smart. And I would have to imagine Tom Allen has been looking at a lot of this West Virginia film for the past 6 months, because as much as they say it's one game at a time, we've already heard Franklin pretty much discussing this being a big game and then other bigger games down the road. Tom Allen's going to want to come in and make a positive first impression. And you have to imagine the way that guy ingests film and lives in his office watching film, that he's going to have this thing game planned pretty well. But Green's a really good quarterback. I was shocked last year on the field after the game how small he was, but that doesn't matter. The guy's nimble, makes people miss, so they have to stop him. And I think if they can do that, or just contain him, I think they're going to be in good shape.
He's a dynamic threat. There's no doubt about it. I think if you can restrict him to the pocket, he becomes a different kind of threat, much less of one, because his completion percentage was not good last year. And we heard from Chris, they really kind of just did throw it deep rather than try and hit short intermediate routes. And so if he's not much better in short and intermediate routes, if they can get him into a passing situations with consistency as this game goes on, that's where the game can really turn for West Virginia's offense in a negative way. And you make a good point about, if you got Dennis Sutton and Abdul Carter going vertical every play, well, Garrett Green will take the bait or we'll give them the bait and make the slip and go off for a first down. So it's going to be fun to follow what Tom Allen dials up in terms of Green. They've also got that dynamic running back duo, CJ Donaldson, Jaheim White. You get a nice blend of speed and power from both of them. And we saw Corey Smith and Quentin Martin, the freshman duo here for Penn State, playing those roles for the scout team last week. I think it's important to note here, though, we're talking about the rushing attack for West Virginia, Daniel, and we just spent all this time, breaking down Penn State's offensive line as they recover from losing 3 guys who are now NFL rookies. Well, West Virginia lost a really good duo of offensive linemen. Doug Nestor, Zach Frazier, they combined for more than 80 starts for the Mountaineers. Frazier was arguably the best center in the country. I think he's going to be a starter for the Steelers this year as a rookie at center. And then Doug Nestor played a lot of guard and at tackle for West Virginia. So just as we're kind of eyeing up things, I know they have confidence down in Morgantown about their group. They have guys who were backups last year who've had playing time, but I look at that and I say, well, if West Virginia doesn't have its act together up front because of some new pieces, this defensive tackle group in particular can be a battering ram that makes life very difficult for them to get off the ground on Saturday.
Kind of reminds me of how we talk about Penn State a little bit when you're talking about losing these key pieces on the offensive line, but you're trusting the seasoning that some of these other backups have had and the experience that they've had in terms of stepping up a little bit. That was something that struck me a little bit. But yeah, I mean, this Penn State defensive tackle group is going to be really interesting to see. I thought that I like James Franklin's baseball metaphor on Wednesday night after practice, where he said that when you're building a baseball team, you build it up the middle, catcher, pitcher, shortstop, center field. That makes your team strong and you can go from there. And he said that you build a defense in a similar way, that defensive tackle, middle linebacker, safety, that's the places you want to be strong. And he feels that Penn State is really strong there. But we know this Penn State offensive line or defensive line, these edge rushers, they can wreck a game. They can make things unwatchable. They can make life miserable for opposing offenses. And so I am intrigued to see if West Virginia has it together. Wyatt Millam is a preseason All Big 12 selection at left tackle. That should be a fun matchup, whether he's getting Abdul Carter, Dennis Sutton, Smith Filbert, Amin Vanover. I think that'll be a good measuring stick for those players to see where they are right now, especially Abdul in his first game, as we think as that edge rusher, somewhere where we think he can have a lot of success. But yeah, I think that the way that you can kind of present this is which team is going to weather those offensive line losses the best, which ones have, this is a good way to see development within programs. I think it's going to be pretty interesting. But if Devon Elise is playing, or Devon J. Thomas is playing like he did to close last year, if Akeem Beeman takes that step forward, if Alonzo Ford brings what he's been doing on the practice field over to game day, I think that things could, and obviously Zane Durant is Zane Durant, I think that things could get pretty dicey pretty quickly. And if you're flushing the quarterback with an interior rush, then you've got those defensive ends and those linebackers and Jalen Reed at the line there to clean it up. It could be a long day for West Virginia.
I think we spent some time here on what the outlook might be for Tom Allen and what he might be dealing with. But Mark, let's go over to Andy Kotelnicki. It's a big debut for him. He was named 24/7 Sports Offensive Coordinator of the Year last year for his work with the Kansas Jayhawks. He is stepping up into a bigger spotlight, and it's in this noon window on Fox. There's going to be a lot of eyes on it. Everyone knows what happened last year for Drew Allar in this offense when there were a lot of eyes on them on a few different occasions. And here we go. It's West Virginia. And last time this happened, Drew Allar looked fantastic, but it ultimately was an outlier on the season for what this passing game was going to accomplish. What are you most curious going into this matchup with Kotelnicki? And generally speaking, what are your expectations for what the offense can go out and do?
Well, first of all, I don't know if you guys realized it, but throughout preseason camp, when we were at practice, Kotelnicki was really kind of light. I mentioned flipping off players, calling them by different nicknames, whacking them with boxing gloves, doing all flexing for the camera when he was wearing the sleeveless shirt. When we were at practice Wednesday, I got none of that, man. He was dialed in. I mean, he was dialed in. So I think we're seeing game week Andy Kotelnicki, where all the goofing off, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I think that's a way that he relates with the players, and I think it's actually a good thing to have some fun. But I think all of that is off to the side. No, listen, we've heard it all, right? Everything has sounded so good up to this point. Misdirection, make them think something's coming one place and you're going to another place. The lingo, it took a while to learn, but it's like building blocks with Legos. Get the ball in the hands of your best playmakers. Great. It all sounds tremendous. Let's see what it's all about. That's why I'm so anxious to see this game. More than any other aspect of it is to see how this offense plays. I don't think it matters who makes the plays. I think it matters that they make plays, because listen, this wasn't a West Virginia defense that stifled Penn State last year. I mean, they had some big plays. So if you come out and lay an egg in this one, then I'm not suggesting they will. How does that bode for the rest of the year? So I think it's important for them to come out and play well. We've seen, under Jomo, against the first couple quality opponents that they faced, it took a while for the offense to get going. I think it could take a while within this game, maybe a quarter or so. But I think it's going to be kind of a red flag if they don't come out and produce over the course of the entire game and get up there into the 30s points-wise. Because I think if they get to 30, I don't think West Virginia can score 30. And I don't care if it's Allar making plays. I don't care if it's Singleton. I don't care if it's Katron Allen. I don't care if it's Tyler Warren. I don't care if it's a breakout player like Trey Wallace. Whoever's making plays, I just want to see it in action. So I don't know exactly what to expect, Tyler, but I'm anxious to see it, and let's see if it's all it's built up to be.
Well, when James Franklin went hunting for his next offensive coordinator, what do we know is on the top of that list? Explosives. That was what they were desperately searching for last year. Yeah. And I'm really curious to see what they do aside from Drew Allar airing the ball downfield. How are they creating explosives by design on when the ball is maybe traveling behind the line of scrimmage, or it's a quick pattern? And then through the blocking downfield and the play design, you're getting big chunks out of it. Something that, self-starting moments that can drive you forward in a possession or on a third down play. And Daniel, maybe we're complicating this a bit because we're 50 minutes just about into this podcast, and we haven't even talked about what may be the best tandem of running backs in college football. I know they feel good about the one they have down in West Virginia, but here it's Kaytron Allen and Nick Singleton, year 3 together. Is it as simple as, hey, Andy, you know what you've got in these two running backs? And like I called for so often last year with Mike Yurcich, feed them the ball, do it consistently.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't feel like we'll get out of a game and look at the box score and they'll each have 9 carries or whatever it was in that Ohio State game. I don't think that'll happen again. But yeah, it is kind of funny when you think about you've got these 2 running backs, both of whom should be draft picks next year. Nick Singleton could potentially be a pretty high draft pick depending on testing and the way the board falls and the inscrutable NFL perception of running backs. And we're not really talking about those guys too much. They feel very set it and forget it. The more interesting thing in that room has been who's going to be number 3 and what Quentin Martin can do. But when we talk about Nick Singleton, I think that he can be a really big beneficiary of what Andy Kotelnicki's MO is in terms of getting guys into space, utilizing your best players. Drew Allar talked about it with both Singleton and Allen, getting them the ball downfield in a one-on-one matchup against the linebacker. And Allar said that that's pretty much automatically a 10 to 12 yard gain, given how these players are. Now, the one wrinkle that I'm really interested in that James Franklin hinted at Wednesday night is seeing a little bit of 20 personnel or 21 personnel where you have both Singleton and Allen on the field together. I believe it was in the Peach Bowl last year. They both started on the field together. And we didn't see that too much under Mike Yurcich. But I think that that's something that could be really interesting. Mixing and matching them over the course of a drive. Is there still going to be a similar sort of rigidity like we saw in terms of one guy getting one drive, another guy getting the other, one guy getting a quarter, one guy getting another? So I think that both of these players can do a lot of different things. I think Allen at this point, we've talked a lot about Singleton's improvement as a receiver. I think Allen is a little underrated as a receiver at this point, given what he's done during his first 2 years. But I think both of these players could have huge years for Penn State. And I think a big reason why will be Andy Kotelnicki and how he's utilizing them and the positions he's putting them in.
Neither of these guys, for as big of stars as they've been since the start here, they're not big personalities in front of a camera. And so I don't think a lot of people have a good sense for Singleton or Kaytron Allen all that much. But every time that you bring up Kotelnicki to them this year and ask about that change, there's a smirk. There's a freshness to the conversation about how they feel they're going to be utilized. And you can maybe pick up on that, some frustration of how they weren't utilized in the past. So year 3 is going to be big for them. I know Jaywan Slater has high expectations for that duo and others in the room as well. Let's dive into our players to watch. We've mentioned a bunch of them, so I'd imagine we can make this one relatively rapid. And we're going to start with you, Mark Brennan. When it comes to this matchup in particular, which player is in the spotlight?
I'm going to go with Tony Rojas. I think as much as West Virginia runs the ball, as well as West Virginia runs the ball, he's going to be in a position to make a lot of tackles. As one program person told us about his ability to get to the ball, it's just the natural ability to defeat blocks and be able to see stuff and be able to understand what gaps are empty and what the running backs are all about. So it's basically talking about a guy who has an innate ability to get to where the ball's going, which probably isn't surprising given that he's a former high school running back himself. And I just think he's going to be running all over the field and have an opportunity to make a ton of tackles in this game.
We have a little bit more on Rojas coming here as we get to our big picture season picks. But Daniel, who's your player in the spotlight for this matchup?
I'm really interested in Jalen Reed, sort of what we highlighted earlier in terms of the being sound on the edge, not letting Garrett Green escape the pass rush and get out into space. I think that Lion spot, which is going to function as that hybrid nickel, Sam linebacker, third safety. Well, I guess we'll know more about that once we get through Saturday, how that is actually going to look. But I think that Reed is someone who can play a pretty big role in this game. And I think that he's someone who's going to play a big role in every game for Penn State this year. He's very well regarded for how he approaches the mental side of the game. And we've seen him make plays before. I think he's someone who can kind of quietly have a big year. KJ Winston has gotten a ton of the hype at safety this offseason. But Reed is someone to watch on that defense. And also interested to see if we do see him back there at punt returner, given what we heard. And I think seeing Caden Saunders at practice, I think points in one direction, but I'm just curious I would be very curious to see Reed in that role, just because it's something that we haven't really seen him in before. And it wasn't really anything we'd heard too much about before this offseason.
That's a good point. And I want to mention, I think I said we had our last look at Penn State before kickoff. That's not true. You both will be in the press box down at West Virginia early on Saturday morning. When Penn State gets in the field, you'll be ready. You'll have binoculars. We have a lot of loose ends to kind of tie up. Who traveled, who didn't, who's dressed, who's not, and also, who's out there and actually active once they get into the point where they have the pads on. So go to lions247.com for that latest information as we get near kickoff on Saturday morning. Certainly encourage you to do that. My player to watch, I think all of our players to watch have established it. Drew Allar is everyone needs to watch him. So I'm going to go with another Drew Shelton. Already explained the strides he made this preseason, rebounding from an injury. He's got a lot of snaps under his belt. This is going to be a big eye-opening experience for a lot of players on the roster, traveling to West Virginia, encountering that atmosphere to kick off a season. That won't be the case for Drew Shelton. This guy started in the Rose Bowl as a freshman. So I think if we get through the 60 minutes of football on Saturday and he's solid, and essentially we're not talking about him, we're not talking about that blind side being impacted and Drew Allar scrambling and having to use that increased athleticism to escape the edge off from the left side, then you think that you kind of weathered that storm in losing maybe the best offensive tackle in football last year. What's it going to look like when you have to replace him? I think Drew Shelton and kind of the litmus test of what we see for these 4 quarters at West Virginia is going to go a long way into whether we think Penn State's going to have to sweat some matchups out with that position or whether they've really stabilized it with the next man up in Drew Shelton. And now we'll get to our predictions as promised a while back. We'll talk about not just the score here, but we're going to offer our bold prediction on a weekly basis. How bold? I guess that's to be determined by our listeners, but we're going to start off our predictions with you, Daniel.
I feel like this has happened to me a bunch of times since I've worked for Lions 24/7, where I make a prediction and then I check the weather forecast after it gets published, and I'm kind of like, ooh, might have done things a little differently there. But we'll see Saturday. It looks like it could be a little messy, especially later on in the afternoon with some storms. But I have some points on the board. I have Penn State 35, West Virginia 21. I see this game going a little similar to last year. I think that Penn State pulls away late. I think that it might be a little bit slow going early on. I am not concerned, but I do have some caution about 3 new coordinators in their first game on the road in a hostile environment with new methods of communication. You can do all the dry runs you want, but when you're out there, it's something completely different. But I do think that Penn State is the more talented team, and I think that Andy Kotelnicki will probably have some tricks up his sleeve for game 1, week 1, to catch West Virginia off guard. And I think Penn State ultimately pulls away and covers. Bold prediction, I'm going to the Drew Allar well, and a little bit of a callback to last year's season opener. Allar threw for 325 yards. Career high, never threw for that many again. I forget how close he came. I think it was in the 290s once maybe, but it wasn't super close. I think he exceeds that 325, even if it is thunderstorming and pouring in the second half. But I think we'll get a really good start from Drew Allar, kind of an announcement that he is back. That 5-star stuff, that's legit. Those games against Ohio State and Michigan last year, that's not who he is. And I think that's what we'll see Saturday.
All right. I think people would appreciate that outcome. Mark, what do you got for us?
I got a 31-17 Penn State winning. Would not be at all surprised, again, if it takes a quarter or so for that Penn State offense to get rolling. I think fortunately you have a coordinator on the other side of the ball in Tom Allen who's operating with more weapons than he's ever had. And as anxious as I am to see what the offense looks like. It's also going to be interesting to see what he's been able to come up with. Remember, Tom Allen has been here since last December, so he didn't take over as the DC until after the bowl game. But what has he told us? He loves to immerse himself in film study, and I can't imagine how much he's looked at preparing for this game. So I think the defense is going to be solid throughout the game. The offense will finally get going, pull away a little bit. Key for Penn State, do not turn the ball over. A punt is far better than a turnover in this game. West Virginia, a great possession team. They'll kill you with time of possession, with limiting your possessions. So even if you don't get points out of one, you have a great punter. Reserve the right to go at them on your next possession. My bold prediction, Penn State's longest run from scrimmage last year was 50 yards by Kaytron Allen. I think as this game goes along, somebody is going to bust one longer than that. I don't know who. It could be Kaytron Allen. It could be Nick Singleton. It could be one of the young backs. It could be a receiver on a jet sweep or an end around. But I think I think the Penn State offense is going to get this defense confused late in the game. In second half, some point, somebody's going to bust a really long run. I know that's pretty bold, but I'll go out on that limb.
I'll follow up here. I also have Penn State improving to 1-0 and got through this early hurdle and what I think will set them up really well to midseason if they can get through this game. I got 30-17 Penn State. I guess I should have mentioned before this, the spread is 8 points. I believe it opened back in the spring around 12. It was in the double digits for almost the entire summer. There's been a late rush of money on the West Virginia side, and so it's dropped down to 8. We've all got them clearing that comfortably. So 30-17 is my pick. I think that I think you make a great point with Tom Allen being around since December. So is Andy Kotelnicki. And we have a lot of excitement about what these two guys can do. Tom Allen getting back to his defensive roots. He's been a head coach in the Big Ten the last 7 years. Andy Kotelnicki viewed as this ascending mastermind on the offensive side of the football. I think what Penn State fans and maybe we need to remind ourselves with their track record, all this excitement is based on rosters that were coached at Indiana, Buffalo, and Kansas. I mean, these guys have reached a different stratosphere in terms of what's at their disposal and how they can utilize different pieces from an athletic standpoint. And they got to go up against a Power 4 opponent right off the bat here. They don't get to test out their new toys against, kind of the cupcakes of the world. But I think it's going to get, we're going to see why these guys are good fits at coordinator. You're going to come out of this game and see flashes of exciting stuff. I don't expect either to be firing on all cylinders, both sides of the ball, but ultimately I think Drew Allar will look steadier, look cleaner than we typically saw him on the road as a sophomore. And ultimately, I think Nick Singleton, you mentioned the 5-star buzz being back for Drew Allar with his performance. I think Nick Singleton has a real chance in a national spotlight to remind people that he is a home run threat from anywhere on the field. He has this new receiving pedigree to him now. And I think after, what you can really categorize as a sophomore slump statistically, you can now really see him shake that off in a big way as he started to at the end of last season. For my bold prediction, I'm going to go with Harrison Wallace surpassing 100 receiving yards. He's obviously a guy that everyone's expecting to step up as wide receiver 1, but what will that look like? I think it'll look really good, and I think it'll look really good right off the jump. To this point, his career high in receiving yards, 72 yards in a single game. Of course, that came last year, season opener against West Virginia. So we got our predictions out there. We got a few more to get to because we have our forecast for the entire 2024 season. So if you stayed with us for the first hour and you need a break, this is probably your chance to do that. But if we're going to roll through, you guys don't get breaks. And we're going to jump right into our big picture 2024 talk right now because things look different for this team. 12-team playoff. They've been the poster child for the program that's been left on the doorstep of the modern-day college football setup. That ends now. It's a new-look Big Ten. You're no longer dealing with what had seemingly become a brick wall of sorts in the Big Ten East. Michigan's not on this schedule. USC is, Washington is, UCLA is, but Michigan is not for the first time in a long time. We'll tell you where we think they finish in the 12 games and their college football status, but we're going to go through different categories here. Offensive MVP, defensive MVP, offensive breakout, defensive breakout. It's going to be some of the common themes that you already probably heard on this show. And so maybe we can summarize it a little bit. But Daniel, you're kicking us off with offensive MVP. I'm going to follow you, and then Mark will round us out for this category.
I went with running back Nick Singleton as my pick. He is in that timeshare with Kaytron Allen, so maybe the counting stats might not be there. But I do think that when you talk about Nick Singleton, the type of player he is a home run hitter going into this year. I think that he's really the only proven home run hitter you have on that offense. And I think that Andy Kotelnicki is really going to use that to his advantage. Sort of what I talked about a little bit ago with Singleton and the type of impact he could potentially have. I just think that when we think back to moments of the season, when we're in December, it's going to be similar to 2022 again. When you think about Singleton busting the big gain at Auburn, when you think about him getting loose and putting teams to bed, I think that that's the type of impact he's going to have this year. Not just the big plays, but big plays in big moments.
I'm next up, and last year my pick at the end of the season was Allar. I was tempted to pick him because he has been truly Mr. Consistent in his throughout his career. But if this team gets to the playoffs, and spoiler alert, I have him getting there. I think Drew Allar is really going to be a catalyst for that. I believe the Nick Singleton's in for a rebound, but you think about what Allar maybe didn't accomplish last year. He didn't throw for 250 passing yards again after that first game until after Thanksgiving. He was under 50% completion in all three of those losses. And yet, at the end of the year, this is a team in the New Year's Six. They had 10 wins. He had 29 total touchdowns with 2 interceptions. So in my mind, it doesn't need to be him making a major leap and looking like a slam dunk #1 NFL draft pick, like he was a #1 quarterback prospect coming out of high school. But if you have true marginal and maybe incremental as the season goes on improvements in all areas of his game, leadership, confidence, throwing the ball downfield, chemistry with his receiving group, his ability to maybe avoid pressure more and create plays with his feet, all that stuff starts to rise him up, and it's going to rise up this entire offense. So that's kind of my forecast. I'm not ready to say he's going to go out and look like, the next Andrew Luck next year's NFL draft, but I do think he's going to improve enough in all facets of his game and his demeanor in the game that it will elevate this offense to where it needs to be in this particular season. And what do you have for us, Marcus? You've got pick number 3 at offensive MVP.
Yeah, I was tempted to go with Katron, but I think there may be an element of Katron, Allen, and Nick Singleton kind of balancing each other out. So I went in a little bit different direction. Clearly a veteran player, well-established. To me, Trey Wallace, you look at what he did last year.
I'm not laughing at, hold on. I'm not laughing at your pick. You're well-established, and this is going to set up something for me.
It's setting it up, folks. It's a bad joke. But in all honesty, you look at what he did in the first 2 games and then the bowl game last year. So the 2 games to start the season and then a game to end the season, 14 catches for 165 yards. In the middle of the season, when he was banged up, 4 catches for 67 yards. So I think he is poised. Again, knock on wood, let's hope he stays healthy. Let's hope everybody stays healthy. I think he's poised to become that wide receiver #1. If he is healthy, I think he could be the kind of consistent wide receiver they haven't had since Parker Washington and then Jahan Dotson before that. Keandre Lambert-Smith, wish him well down at Auburn. But what we saw from him was a roller coaster every single season. I think Harrison Wallace has an opportunity to step up, be that wide receiver 1, get it done game in and game out, but he just has to stay healthy. But definitely, a veteran player, well-known, everybody knows about him. So it's an opportunity for him to step up and even further expand his well-knownness.
Thank you for that, Mark. But don't go anywhere. You're starting us off on our next category, defensive MVP. So who are you starting us off with?
Well, this was to me, the easiest one of all, Abdul Carter. I think a fair argument could be made that Abdul could have been defensive MVP for the team last year. At the banquet, the team selected Adisa Isaac, which I don't really have a problem with. But I think if you look at the numbers and what both guys did, Abdul Carter was unbelievable. I am just another one of those things that I'm really looking forward to. This guy was so good that they decided to move him to defensive end in the offseason. And then he adjusted to that so well that they decided to add linebacker back in. And I think you add in what I was talking about before with Tom Allen. This guy has been brainstorming, I'm sure, since last December on how to unleash Abdul Carter on opposing defenses or opposing offenses. It'll be something if he is unleashed on the defenses too. Then it'll be really versatile. But on opposing offenses, And I just think it's going to be really fun to see all of the different things that they're able to do with him. Anxious to see what he does against West Virginia. If they're somehow able to win this game relatively comfortably, and they don't have to show everything, it could be unbelievable when we get to the Big Ten and what they're going to do with this guy. So I just think, to me, this was an easy one that Abdul Carter, I think, has an opportunity to have just an outstanding year.
Got one look at one-on-one work with Abdul Carter, and it came on Wednesday night, and it was well worth the wait at the expense of Anthony Donko. But that jump, that get-off, every bit of good as what we saw from Chop Robinson last year. We know that what that meant for Chop Robinson, even though he didn't put up the pile of sacks that he had hoped to. He was a first-round pick. And so, really, really excited to see Abdul Carter in action. Daniel, your next defensive MVP.
I think I'm pretty well established that I'm a big fan of this player. I went with safety KJ Winston. I think that he has that versatility that you can move him around your defense. He's not afraid to be physical in run support. We saw some good ball skills last year. He's long, he's rangy on the back end. And I think that playing alongside Jalen Reed and Zachy Wheatley will help him. I think it'll help all of those guys make plays. But I just think Winston has all of those tools to be able to do a bunch of different things. I don't know if it'll quite be to the level of what we saw Jair Brown do in his last 2 years in terms of literally doing everything on that defense. But I think that Winston is someone that Tom Allen can use in some interesting ways, especially when you get into passing downs with sub packages. And I think that Winston is going to make the most of it and be one of these guys at the end of the year that really shaped how this Penn State defense played.
And leadership will be a big part of KJ Winston's DNA. Same deal with my pick here, Kobe King. I mean, he was selected a team captain like Winston for this defense. And you think about the steps he has made on the field. He was in the wrong end of a 60-40 split a couple years ago with Tyler Elston. Tyler Elston started every regular season game, I believe, and the Rose Bowl at middle linebacker in 2022. Then Kobe King, flips that, takes advantage of Tyler Elston being sidelined last spring and just asserts himself over the course of the year. He's your starting Mike linebacker. But when we review those snap counts on a weekly basis, and when we were reviewing them really the first half of last season, he was more of a part-time piece. Even though he was a starter, he wasn't really out there on the field as much as some of the other players who were in that starting group. But that changed in a big way. He became a mainstay for this defense during the second half of the season in Big Ten action, really proved himself, finished second on the team in tackles. And I think, although I was really tempted to go with Tony Rojas here, I looked at Denai Dennis Sutton, I looked at Jalen Reed, and that kind of speaks to the depth of this defense because there's a lot of names you can go with. I just think Kobe King is going to have a production spike, so the stats will look good, and I think he is going to be the extension of Tom Allen on the field. KJ Winston certainly is going to be an extension of the staff too, but he's going to have that in-helmet communication, and Kobe King really just feels like the guys, whether it's a defensive tackle or a cornerback, in the heat of the moment when they got to find their footing and they're looking to somebody, I think he's going to be that guy often. So I think the combination of those two things make him my MVP pick. And we'll go to breakouts now. And this one sticks with me. And I know that Mark built his case for Harrison Wallace's MVP and mentioned several times there him being well-established and well-known and Mr. Popular. But I think we're at risk of living in our own bubble here in Happy Valley. There's not a lot of people talking about Trey Wallace as one of the reasons Penn State's going to contend for a college football playoff spot. I mean, I know people know he's existed here. He's done stuff here, but he's never had 20 catches in a season. He's got fewer career touchdowns than Omari Evans and Khalil Dinkins. And he's a guy that, for one reason or another, and it's really been injury related, has just not been able to string together the kind of games that I think is necessary to establish yourself as a well-regarded member and a top flight member of the star cast here. And I think that changes in a big way. I think he goes from a guy who had a consistent role as kind of the fourth wide receiver of Mark's getting his binder out over here now. But I think when it comes to Harrison Wallace, what I'm projecting here, Mark, and this is the most important part, I think breakout, it can mean a guy who's going from a bench role to a starting role, or it can mean a guy who's going from he's on the field and he's involved to he's a big all Big Ten player. And so I think Harrison Wallace has a chance to double up his career totals for receptions. I think he has a chance to double up his career receiving yards, which is 501 yards. And I think at the end of the day, I'm projecting him to have the most productive season for any Penn State wide receiver since Jahan Dotson back in 2021 became an All-American and a first-round draft pick. And so for a guy that has 500 yards through his first 3 years here and has really struggled to put 2 consistent games together over the course of his career, again, due to injury for the most part, for him to go from being that to being Drew Allar's #1 target and the guy that defensive coordinators are going to have to really account for at receiver, unlike anyone that Penn State has had at that position for the last 3 years, that's where I'm basing the breakout on. I think there's different levels of breakouts from which point you're going to the next point. And I respect your views and I like the MVP pick, but that's why I'm going with the breakout. And we can have maybe a poll up on the site to determine whether Harrison Wallace is a breakout pick. But I think regardless, people, whether he's MVP or breakout, people will be very happy one way or another. And I think we're all channeling, Daniel included, a lot of optimism about what Trey Wallace is going to do for this team in 2024. That's the main point you should take from this.
You don't have to respect my views. We could have fun with this. You could make fun of my pick and I can make fun of yours. I'm next, though. And, I was going to go with Nick Singleton because he only has 1,800 career rushing yards. And, that's nowhere near what some of the Penn State greats have. But instead, I'm going to go with somebody who had no stats registered last year, only played in 3 games. And, yeah, I'm taking it a little different. Obviously, what Tyler's saying is absolutely correct. Harrison Wallace has an opportunity to emerge on the national stage. I'm going with somebody that Penn State fans really haven't seen and I think has an opportunity to become a household name in Happy Valley and maybe even beyond this year. He's going to be playing behind Tyler Warren, but I think Andrew Rapplier, a guy who, again, spent an extra reclassified in high school. So he spent an extra year at the high school level, came into Penn State last year, physically mature, could have played, but they didn't need him because they were so deep at tight end. And now you're looking at a guy who, when they talk about him, they're talking about him in the same breath as Pat Fryermuth, in the sense, not that he's the second coming, but in the sense that he loves doing all those different aspects that a lot of times tight ends don't love to do. Obviously, pass catching is one of them, but he came in really just getting into the whole blocking aspect of it. So I think you're going to have Tyler Warren playing really well, and then right below him, you're going to have Andrew Rapplier, a chance to do some really good things. He's big, he's athletic. Everybody talks about his attitude and just kind of outgoing. They call him Baby Gronk because he's a little crazy in a good way, we're told. And I just think he has all those tools to be a guy who really emerges. Again, I look at that wide receiver group, and if they aren't quite what they need to be early, I think Andrew Rapplier is another one of those guys who could help offset that. So I'm going with Andrew, and a little different kind of a breakout player, but that's the fun of doing these things, is we could look at it in different ways and then bust each other's you-know-whats over it.
Daniel has been kindly sitting by as me and Mark have been texting jabs at each other and exchanging them in person and on the podcast this week, and made his pick without any drama to it. Where did you land?
Well, I want to say I went and I checked the numbers in the poll that Mark put in the bottom of our post, and Harrison Wallace is leading the way right now at 35% as the breakout player.
That's because people are all taking that false notion of what a breakout player is.
Pushing a false narrative. Daniel, what kind of narrative are you?
I set up the poll, by the way. So if the votes are wrong, it's my fault. I can't argue. This isn't political. I accept the poll results. I think they're perfectly fine.
Well, my pick's coming in second with 24% right now, and that's Liam Clifford. I think that every time James Franklin got asked about Harrison Wallace this fall, Liam Clifford was right there. Those two were pretty attached at the hip anytime that the wide receivers were talked about. And I think that Clifford, we've heard good things about him, not just from James Franklin, but from Trey Wallace, from other teammates. I think there's a level of reliability there. There's a level of experience. His quarterback background in high school has come up, being the little brother of Sean, having all that experience with someone who is in the NFL right now playing quarterback. That has come up as something that has helped form Clifford as a receiver. I do think that he adds a good level of versatility to this Penn State offense. He can play on the outside. He can play in the slot. He's got good size if he plays in the slot. And we've seen him do some nice things. I mean, that catch against Illinois last year along the sideline was probably one of the better moments for the Penn State wide receiver core last year. So I think with Clifford, I think he's very, very well positioned. He has 21 career catches for 219 yards. Hasn't found the end zone yet in his career, but I think that he is definitely in position to be that number 2 wide receiver. You think about when that season Jahan Dotson had, where he went over 1,100 yards, one of the best receiving seasons in Penn State history. Parker Washington was right there with, I think, 820 yards. I don't necessarily think any wide receiver will get that high, or 2 will get that high, given what Penn State has on the running game. But I think that it'll be something similar where you're getting just really solid production from these 2 players. And I think that Clifford is really going to take that step forward in year 4 at Penn State.
Daniel, it's your turn to double dip. You finished off that category and you get us going for our last one before we give our season predictions, defensive breakout picks, and Daniel, lead us off.
Yeah, when you were talking about being in our bubble and kind of having perceptions of these players as already being broken out or already being kind of known commodities, that one struck me with my pick, because even though we didn't hear about him until the spring, Audavian Collins, the cornerback who transferred in from Mississippi State last year, didn't really play last year. A lot in front of him, but by all accounts came out this spring knowing that there was an opportunity there and really tried to grab it by the horns. And we'll see. We've talked about it when putting together this depth chart, where to put the oar at cornerback, how many oars to put in, where to put guys, try to figure out what the combinations are going to be. It's something that I'm just interested to see on Saturday, just so I know. That's what a lot of this stuff is for waiting to see Saturday. Like, I just want to know how, who's where, how this is going to work. But by all accounts, Collins had a great camp, great summer. The wide receivers were quick to mention him as one of the most improved players on the team. And I think that that's something that can really shine through. So I think that Audavian Collins, someone that probably, a decent number of Penn State fans, he probably isn't on their radar, but he can break out, put himself in that position. And I think that, he'll be that dictionary definition of a breakout player by the time we get to December.
And has there ever been so much public praise for a guy who had 8 defensive snaps the year before? I mean, it's been unbelievable what we've heard about this guy with Franklin repeatedly pointing to him as his breakout, and Terry Smith saying he could be the best cornerback in the room. It's remarkable. And now we'll see what comes to light as the season arrives. I got the next pick, and it feels like this was tailor-made for Tony Rojas, considering the way we've talked about him since he showed up to campus in January of 2023. I would compare him a bit to Andrew Rapplier's situation, a guy who walked in with the abilities and the physical tools to play at a high level at the Power 4, Power 5 level, but he didn't need to because of what was ahead of him. They stayed healthy. They were productive at linebacker at the top of the depth chart. It was one of the best defenses in America. And so most of the time when we saw Tony Rojas, the game was a bit out of hand. But guys, we noticed him every time, right? I mean, whether it was the Peach Bowl, late at Maryland when he had 2 takeaways, I mean, he was just a presence on the field. And it sounds like that's what he has been on the practice field, really going back to his freshman year. He's already seemingly achieved this respected veteran status, it feels like, on the roster. And it's kind of crazy. He hasn't even started a game yet. But I think he's going to become one of the faces of this defense, maybe of this entire program eventually. Maybe it's sooner rather than later. Ultimately, I think you really can push for that MVP kind of acknowledgement by the end of the season. If he stays healthy and he's out there and he's flying around with the speed that he brings, it's just at a different level. And on top of that, I think he just wants to be great. You heard about some of these guys that we've seen within the program over the years, Saquon Barkley, Micah, the guys on the current team you heard about too. Mike Singleton, just show up to campus. They want to be great. We're hearing about Cooper Cousins. That's what we're hearing about Tony Ross too. And I know it's one thing to have that mindset, the next to produce, but I have confidence he's going to go out there and really be a game wrecker in a way that some of the other blue chip linebackers who have come to campus maybe didn't always materialize into that during their career and went to the NFL and had opportunities. I think this is a guy that we will see him make that transition and become someone who can swing momentum at any given moment. Mark, where do you finish the conversation for defensive breakouts?
I want to apologize if my text message sound is coming across.
I was wondering who the hell that was.
You're not going to believe who it is. It's Dave Jones. He finally retires, and he's texting me about the Phillies.
You sure you want to share this? You sure you want to share this?
Yeah, I don't care. I'm trying to turn it off on my laptop, and I'm worried that I'm going to shut everything down. So I apologize that Dave is texting me about the Phillies. So we thought we were done.
He's retired.
We were done with him. Yeah, he retires, and now he's horning in, sending like Morse code on. So I'm like looking at this. He's telling me about Taiwan Walker, and I'm like, I'm trying to say, dude, I'm doing a podcast here, So anyway, that's what's happening. I figured people would get a kick. I knew Daniel especially.
Tell Dave I said hi.
Yeah, so Dave he's making his way back into a podcast one way or the other. Hey, I'm going to go with the guy who I think a lot of us figured could be in this position last year, in Zakee Wheatley. He was coming off a season the previous year, in which he had 373 snaps, a couple of interceptions, a fumble recovery. And then last year, it just wasn't there. He was limited to 257 snaps. The defense as a whole didn't play a ton of snaps, but he was clearly behind Jalen Reed and KJ Winston. And it just wasn't there for him. This offseason, James Franklin said, the lights come on for him now. It's just a level of maturity. And when we talked to Anthony Poindexter back in June, I think it was, he actually referred to Zakee Wheatley as one of their 3 starters at safety, which I think we all realize that even though they may not start in a 4-2-5, I think we're going to see a lot of that with Jalen Reed playing the line position that you talked about. Zakee Wheatley was a 2-time takeaway king. Back in 2022, I believe it was in the spring and the preseason. And then he reestablished himself as that in this preseason. So I think he's poised for a big year. This is a little bit more along the Trey Wallace, a guy who has played some football and has been in big games. But I think he really has a chance to elevate things to a whole different level as that center fielder. I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on opposing quarterbacks. Maybe not this week with a running quarterback, but I think it's a situation where he's going to be in a position to benefit from that. Maybe snagging interceptions or running up and picking up fumbles. I think he's going to make a bunch of big plays for them. So I'm going with Zakee Wheatley.
All right, good stuff, gentlemen. Fun to get that all out in the open. We'll see how silly or smart we look come Thanksgiving time and on these picks. And this, of course, is the one that we're going to be measured on the most, is our regular season picks for Penn State, and that's how we'll finish this episode. We hope this episode has done well to set the stage for you for season opener on Saturday. Mark, you're leading us off season record and whether or not Penn State makes its first playoff.
I do think Penn State makes its first playoff. I'm going 10-2. I'm to the point now where Penn State's going to have to beat Ohio State under James Franklin for me to believe that it's going to happen. It should be a great opportunity for them to do it, but they just seem to not function properly in late game situations. So I'm going to have to see that to believe it. And then, there's some other potential landmines, but the game that is really sticking out to me is that USC game. I've mentioned this. I think I may have mentioned it before in the podcast even, but Penn State's only traveled more than 1,000 miles for an in-season game. So we're not counting that very first game going over to Ireland, because you have a different run-up to that back in 2014. It was the Nebraska game back in 2020. They lost that game. This is going to be 2,500 miles each way. They're talking about potentially leaving from Harrisburg, maybe leaving earlier in the week. And the one thing we've learned about this program, for better or worse, and a lot of times it's for better, is that they're creatures of habit. Structure is the key. Every week being the same helps them be successful. I wonder, getting taken out of that comfort zone, how they're going to react. So I know Penn State's favored in the FPI, I think given a 60-some% chance to win that USC game. But I just wonder, with all the different things going around, how they're going to adjust to making that trip. And if it isn't that game, there are some other landmines out there. I mean, Wisconsin is always a difficult place to play. Minnesota. Penn State didn't have a great trip there the last time it went. And never sleep on Purdue. I don't care how good or how bad Purdue is. They can give people fits in that stadium. So there are some different landmines. I look at them being 10-2, maybe right there on the cusp of getting a home game. I think you could potentially sneak into a home game if you have 2 losses, depending on who those losses are to.
And that you talked about, oh, you're willing to travel as far as you need to for a college football playoff game. You might need to travel about 2 miles, Mark. If that were the case here in Happy Valley,
I would like that.
It would be the weekend before Christmas, and what a setting that would be. First round playoff game. Daniel, do you have Penn State putting themselves in the mix for such an outcome?
I do have Penn State making their first college football playoff. I'm right along there with Mark, 10-2. I thought that one of our commenters on the Lions Fried on Lions 24/7 pretty astutely noted maybe a little bit of gun shyness from us when it comes to picking Penn State to go 11-1. But I'm in the same boat as Mark. I need to see it to believe it when it comes to Penn State and Ohio State. And also, I think there are some other landmines in here. I know Mark talked about USC. I think the Wisconsin game stands out to me. Coming off that bye week, if you go out to USC, score a big win, you come back, you have a week off, reamping to go to Wisconsin at Madison, which is always a fun environment. I think those Minnesota and Purdue games in November, those can be potentially dicey, just being on the road and the sort of unpredictability when it comes to those opponents and Big Ten West teams getting up every once in a while. But I just think that this Penn State team, though, is too talented to be outside of that top 12. I think that you're going to see with Andy Kotelnicki and Tom Allen, 2 playoff level offenses and defenses. And I think that will get Penn State in. And I think that they can be in that 7-8 range, maybe up towards 6 to host that home playoff game.
All right, well, we're 3 for 3 on thinking that we're going to have some extra coverage that's not going to involve a bowl trip in December. I do think they will punch their ticket to the college football playoff. I also am going with 10-2, and the season will be defined by, I think, that 3-game stretch at USC bye week. It's a 3-game stretch over 4 weeks. At USC, the bye week, at Wisconsin and Ohio State. Daniel, you bring up all the potential factors at Wisconsin. That could be a tremendous environment for the Badgers at home for that matchup. A couple of years ago, Penn State got out of there by the skin of their teeth. But like you said, if they come out of the USC game, we all have them beating West Virginia, and I think that's probably the biggest hurdle that we see on the schedule before mid-October. So if they were to be unbeaten coming out of USC and ranked very highly, hearing a lot of great things about themselves during the bye week and being featured nationally a bunch, that does scare me, because not only are you trying to come up and reamp, as you said, but you've got Ohio State. So there's every reason in the world to look past Wisconsin. It's the very next Saturday Ohio State comes and visits you. So I don't think that if you put these 2 teams on a neutral field on Saturday, Wisconsin and Penn State would have much of an issue. I'd like them in that matchup. But psychologically, we've seen this crazy things happen, and it can really mess with those matchups. And I think just over the course of the season, I haven't seen an 11-on-11 rep from this offense. I've heard a lot of nice things about how it's progressed, how it's trickier, all the great things Andy Kotelnicki is going to do to put the best weapons in the best positions possible, and how Drew Allar is going to take the next step. But I haven't seen Drew Allar react to facing pressure from Abdul Carter. I haven't seen Drew Allar trust in Trey Wallace to throw it deep, matched up against A.J. Harris at cornerback. I haven't seen Drew Allar, take on Kobe King and hit Tyler Warren by reading the play. There's a bunch of stuff that I can't just imagine and say it's going to happen in games. And so for that reason, I'm going to go 10-2. I'm not faulting Penn State for not letting us in for a full scrimmage. I'm just going to be honest. If we had seen some of this stuff and seen some explosive plays and seen Drew Allar take a big step, because I don't think Penn State's going to face a better defense than what they currently see in August, I probably would have been more willing to go put my 2 feet on the bandwagon and say they can win 11 games, they can win 12 games. But I can't do it just based off anecdotal evidence. So I'm going to go 10-2 for Penn State. I do think they get in the college football playoff. And from there, I think it's going to depend on the offense. I think by the time we get to November, this defense will really be at a similar level to where they were last year. I truly believe they have the talent, and I think Tom Allen does have the insight to get that done. My question is, will the offense be buzzing by November? Because if it's not, then it could be a repeat performance of last year where, they face a talented team in the playoff and they're just not ready offensively. But if that offense is buzzing, this team can win the Big Ten title. This team can win a college football playoff game and advance in it. But so much of it comes down to let's see it. And that happens on Saturday. And guys, I appreciate you sitting with me for this marathon edition of the Lions 24/7 podcast. I know we've had a bunch of them in August, but really try to give our listeners, our viewers, and our readers the best picture that we have of Penn State and the best way we could possibly do it this month. And so I appreciate you both for doing it alongside me. And Mark, Daniel, any last words before you guys hit the road to Morgantown?
No, it'll be fun. I mean, we'll be there typically several hours before the game. So as you mentioned earlier, be prepared for notes from the press box. Something different to realize is that it's a larger travel roster for a non-conference game than it would be for a Big Ten game. So the guys who do travel, some of the freshmen, it may be a different look than what we see when the Big Ten schedule rolls around, but looking forward to coverage before, during, and after the game.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to getting out to Morgantown. I covered a game there back in 2015 when I was covering Maryland, and it was a great environment, a ton of fun. Really enjoyed my time there. And I think that Saturday's atmosphere as a season opener on national TV with two teams that have a lot of high expectations is going to be a ton of fun. And I think that it's a game that can really live up to the hype. So excited to get out there, excited to get some answers, and excited to get going.
And we'll get our first post-game podcast of 2024 coming your way Saturday. Win or lose, there'll be plenty to talk about. We'll do that. Daniel will be down in Morgantown. I'll be here at our Happy Valley headquarters, and we'll break down what we saw. And there'll be plenty of coverage coming out of this matchup. Snap counts coming your way on Sunday. A lot of analysis on this game one that we've been waiting a long time for. On behalf of our whole crew at Lions 24/7, want to quickly encourage you, get over there, take advantage of the 75% offer with our kickoff special. But that's it for this episode. On behalf of Daniel, Mark, Grace Brennan, our photographer, Tyler Calvaruso, our recruiting insider. Big season ahead. I'm Tyler Downhue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.